Hi, I'm Artemis, and welcome to my channel. In one of my previous projects, I made this laser cut mimic chest to use as a dice box. As my die collection continues to grow for various different games, the chest is rather full and it can't close its mouth all the way. So let's make another one. Bear in mind, this is not my design, but rather an open source and free design that I found on makerdesignlab.com. Here you can see the website, which has an easy to follow step-by-step guide on how to do this project. It also includes a material list and a tools list. The page also includes free templates both in PDF and SVG, so you can download whichever you want. The rest of the page include both assembly instructions and also painting instructions on how to achieve that weathered look. I am really lucky to have a job that grants me access to quite a lot of equipment. If you don't have access to such equipment, don't get discouraged. I'll share some tips and tricks later in the video. This is the program we use at my workplace. It's called Flexi Designer, and I have a fairly basic understanding of it, but I can make simple stuff and print pre-made files. The laser cutter we have is called Epilogue Fusion, and it's a fairly professional one considered what I'm using it for, as it's really intended for industrial use. What I really like about this one is that it's fairly easy to use because it has its own print manager. It's also really easy to use in terms of splitting your files by color, for instance, like this template was, and it can automatically tell which parts to engrave and which parts to treat as a vector file for cutting. Once I've done that, I'm pretty much ready to print. So I can just press print and it will send the files to the laser cutter itself. And whenever I'm ready with my materials, I can just press play. Unfortunately, this part of the video will have a yellow tint on it, and that's not my editing, but rather the lid of the laser cutter. It's a safety measure for this model, and it helps reduce the amount of visible light which you can observe from outside the laser cutter. This type of laser cutter is actually a dual type laser cutter with both CO2 and fiber options. However, in this project I'm only using the CO2 laser. So for a project like this, when I engrave something, I want a deep engrave because it will be easier to paint afterwards. Whereas with the cutting, it's important to note how thick your material is, and I've measured my plywood here to be 3mm, which is pretty standard. When I'm happy with all my settings, I have to choose a method of focus for the laser, which can either be done by loading a predetermined thickness in the material, or it can use a plunger function to determine how it should focus the laser all on its own. And with the cutting all done, we can start the assembly. I have arranged all the pieces, and since I've done it before, I just went by eye this time. Having taken a little break from gaming for the summer, I have rearranged my gaming station into a workstation. But it's still a bit awkward getting the camera angles right. Still, I hope it's fun to watch this coming together. So I started gluing together my mimic chest with super glue, as I figured this would save me some time. some paint. This project were easier to paint step by step than painting it all in the end. So you see me going back and forth quite a bit, alternating between gluing and assembling, and painting the different pieces of the mimic. I started painting the body of the chest with a Warpaint Fanatic brown oak, before I painted all the details with the Warpaint Fanatic's greedy gold. This time around I wanted to try something a bit different, so instead of going for that weathered look, I went for a more shiny look, even though the colors were pretty much the same. For the eye, I used the Warpaint Fanatic matte white and matte black for the pupil, as well as the Warpaint Fanatic Barbarian flesh to make the small capillaries in the eyeball. In my last video, I said I wanted to train my creativity and maybe even inspire creativity in others. Therefore, you might be wondering why I'm working on a project that I didn't design or come up with myself. I chose this project for two reasons. Both that it was fun the first time around, but also because I had the evening to myself and I figured that this was an appropriate sized project to finish in one evening. Even though I didn't design it, I still think it's a good project. There are endless projects out there that are both free and open source. And there are projects for laser cutting, 3D printing, and many other types of projects that can inspire you. However, I wouldn't say that this is not creative. Even though you're following a guide, you still have creative freedom to make the end results as you desire. In this particular project, these factors are the choice of colors on the paint and the additions to the finished product. For instance, you could inline the inside of the mimic with felt so it looks like a red mouth when the chest is opened, or you could add a tongue. Using pre-existing builds and projects as a stepping stone to get started is completely valid in my opinion. And if you want to create something but find yourself in that state of staring at a blank canvas and not knowing where to start, then it's a lot easier to get started. The most important thing is just to start creating or working on a project, and in doing so you'll probably learn something and get some practice. This will in turn lower the bar for starting on your next project. And a few projects in, maybe you don't use a guide anymore, maybe it's all you. I think that's kind of what happened to me. By having to make things at work and following guides, I learned to be more creative and come up with my own ideas. Now I realized that not everyone has access to the equipment used in these types of projects. The equipment is often very expensive, and I wouldn't have access to it if I weren't working where I am. However, there are places where you can use equipment like this. My first tip is to find out if there's a local makerspace hosted nearby, or any other kind of crafts and creative events or clubs. If that's not an option, my second tip is to check whether there are businesses or, for instance, an educational institution, such as a university, that utilizes these types of machines. Often you can rent time or pay a small fee for someone to print or laser cut a file for you. It never hurts to ask anyway. And if all that fails, my last tip is that you will always have web shops. There's a host of different people online that can print stuff on demand, whether it be your own 3D files or pre-existing versions in the web shop. Just watch out for copyright and IP related issues if you result in going this route. If you get really into these sort of projects, basic 3D printers and mini tabletop laser cutters are reaching fairly affordable prices if you wish to make that investment. Here you can see me assembling the hinges of the chest. These are the hardest part of the build, although they're not really that difficult. A small tip here would be to sand the edges a bit, because they're quite a snug fit. If you have a very thin file for miniature making, you can also sand a bit in the back of the chest, where the pegs are supposed to go. As I'm almost done with the project, I wanted to break down the time I spent doing it. In total I spent around 1 hour and 40 minutes assembling and painting the mimic, and then around 20 minutes for the laser cutter to do its thing. It's not bad for a fairly short project, and it can be easily qualified as a one-day build. However, being quite new to both video and audio editing, what's taken me the most time with this video has definitely been the editing side of it. And here's the finished mimic. I really like how it turned out, and that it's a bit more shiny than its predecessor. This one will be used for the normal tabletop RPG dice, whereas the old one will be reserved for Warhammer Underworld dice. I also really like how they look next to each other, almost as if they're hatching a mischievous plan. I hope this project has inspired you to try creating something. And if you've made it all the way to the end, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you back for my next project.